to a culmination. Jeremiah 38. Jeremiah 38. We're coming to a culmination. There have been warnings that have been put out for centuries. Most of the kings didn't listen to them. Most of them had their own thoughts and what they wanted to do. And go ahead and switch the lapel. They had their thoughts and what they wanted to do and how they wanted to go about it. And they kind of ignored what God had said. So we've come to a point here. The armies are at the door. This is what Isaiah said all those years back in the reign of Hezekiah. This is what the prophets have been telling us. This is what Moses warned them about. But they still weren't listening. Now that's staggering to think about when it comes to that point that there is, it's staggering. It comes to that point. All this is happening, but yet they're still not listening. So Jeremiah chapter 38, we looked at last week how that they had thrown Jeremiah in the dungeon, how they'd taken him out now, Ebed-Melech, and those men dared to stand up and say this is wrong. Now Jeremiah is brought before Zedekiah the king. And we'll start here in verse 14. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him into the third entry that is in the house of the Lord. And the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask a thing, hide nothing from me. Then Jeremiah said unto Zedekiah, now these are real relevant questions here. If I declare it unto thee, wilt thou not surely put me to death? And if I give thee counsel, wilt thou not hearken unto me? So Zedekiah the king sware secretly unto Jeremiah, saying, now see if you notice something different from what Zedekiah responds from what Jeremiah says. And we'll come to that in a minute. So Zedekiah the king sware secretly unto Jeremiah, saying, as the Lord liveth that made us this soul, I will not put thee to death, neither will I give thee into the hand of these men that seek thy life. Then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, thus saith the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if thou wilt assuredly go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live and thine house. But if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylon's princes, then shall this city be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. And Zedekiah the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand, and they mock me. There were certain of the Jews that had went over to the Babylonian side as this is going on, and he's afraid of them. But Jeremiah said, they shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord, which I speak unto thee. So it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. But if thou refuse to go forth, this is the word that the Lord has showed me. And behold, all the women that are left in the king of Judah's house shall be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes. And these women shall say, thy friends have set thee on and have prevailed against thee. Thy feet are sunk in the mire, and they are turned away back. So they shall bring out all thy wives and thy children to the Chaldeans. And thou shalt not escape out of their hand, but thou shalt be taken by the hand of the king of Babylon. And thou shalt cause this city to be burned with fire. We're going to stop right there and go before the Lord in prayer. Lord, I pray that you just have your hand upon us this evening. Pray you'd encourage our hearts, have your hand with us. And Lord, I pray that you just have your hand upon us. Wake us up as a nation. Let us realize our need. But Lord, help us always to listen to you as well. And Lord, I pray you just have your hand and have your help and just your strength. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Barb Barb's granddaughter was in kindergarten, and there was this boy in her class that just wouldn't listen to the teacher. And that one day he wasn't listening again, and the teacher told him, since you don't want to listen, you go sit at that table by yourself. Well, after a few minutes, Barb's granddaughter raised her hand and said, I don't want to listen either. Can I go sit with him? You know, sometimes sometimes rather than listening, we want to work out our own solution to things and come up with our own ideas on how to handle things. And often they don't come out so well. I didn't hear the rest of the story with that, but I imagine Barb's granddaughter kind of got in trouble too, and I would probably say she wound up at the table by herself too. But rather than listening, sometimes we want to work out our own solutions to what God has said. We want to come up with our solutions rather than going by what the Bible has to say. And that is the case right here. Zedekiah, and quite frankly, most of the kings of Judah and all the kings of Israel worked out their own solutions. Rather than trying to listen to God, they did what they wanted to do. Now, as we look at this here, I think we need to gather some thoughts here. And first of all, obedience is more than listening. Have you ever been listening to somebody? And guys are real good with this with their wives. Have you ever been listening but not really paying heed? Don't give me that look, honey. But you know, sometimes we do that, don't we? Yeah. We hear, but we don't really pay heed. So Zedekiah sends for Jeremiah, and he does it in secret. Now there's some intrigue going on here. We don't quite know the full extent of it, but the princes appear to be, those nobles within the government appear to be exercising a lot of power here that was normally for the king. Now how that came about, we're not told, and how that went on, we don't know. But there seems to be all of that. So Zedekiah, rather than standing up and saying, what has been done is wrong, Zedekiah, hey, Jeremiah, get Jeremiah, be sneaky about it. Rather than standing up for what's right, Zedekiah does the right thing in secret. That's a bad way to do it. Verse 14. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him in the third entry that is in the house of the Lord. And the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask thee a thing. Hide nothing from me. He asked to hear everything. Now this is an interesting thing for him to do, because he has heard the same message that he is about to hear several times. The Bible has given it before. The warnings were made clear back in Isaiah. The warnings were made clear back in Moses when he warned if they forsook God, there would be consequences from another nation. Isaiah names out who it's going to be. And when we look at all this, he's heard this before. And he knows what's going to be said, but he wants to hear everything. Hide nothing from me. It's redundant. He's heard it before. I don't know if he's hoping the message has changed, or there's some other way to get out of it, or whatever it is. I mean, the gods of the nations were changeable. God is not. But he didn't want to, he wanted to hear it, but there's a problem there. And Jeremiah asks him two questions. Verse 15. Then Jeremiah said unto Zedekiah, if I declare it unto thee, wilt thou not surely put me to death? And if I give thee counsel, wilt thou not hearken unto me? If I tell you, will you have me killed? Now that's a valid question because he has allowed those that have sought his life to nearly take it. That's a good question to ask. Are you fishing for something? Are you trying to get something out of me that you're going to kill me for it? That's the thought there. The second thought is, if I give thee counsel, wilt thou not hearken unto me? Now, that word hearken is a little bit more. We think listen, and we just have a couple listener here, and that means you hear it. Does somebody hearing something necessarily mean they agree with it, or they will go along with it, or that they really understand all of it? The word hearken wraps all that up together. It means not only to hear, but to understand and to take heed to what is said, to do what's being said. So how does the king respond? When we look at verse 16, we see this here. So Zedekiah the king swears secretly unto Jeremiah. Again, he does it sneakily, saying, As the Lord liveth, that made us this soul, I will not put thee to death, neither will I give thee into the hand of the men that seek thy life. Do you notice something missing? Now, he promises he's not going to kill the preacher. Now, as a preacher, I think that's a good thing. He's not going to kill the preacher. Well, that's probably a good thing. Oh, gracious, yeah. I mean, you look at, you see that, when I took Ralph out to lunch this week, I run into the retired pastor of Shawco Baptist Church, where John Weatherford is buried nearby there. And we got talking about John Weatherford, what he went through for the cause of Christ, and how he was thrown in jail and all of that, and just the things that he went through. Now, that's a good thing. He's not going to get Jeremiah out of jail, but he's not going to kill him. And he throws in a little bonus. I won't give you to the ones that want to kill you. Well, that's a blessing. But do you notice what's missing? Is he going to listen? Is he going to hearken? There is a problem. It's good he doesn't try to kill the preacher, but he ought to listen to what is being said. It does him no good just to listen. He needed to obey. Now, there were those that heard. Jeremiah 18, verse 11. Now, therefore, go speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I frame evil against you, and devise a device against you. Return every one now from his evil way, and make your ways and your doings good. And they said, There is no hope, but we will walk after our own devices, and will everyone do after the imagination of their evil heart. They listened, but they did not hearken. And that's what was going on then. And they get to verse 18. Then they say, Come and let us devise devices against Jeremiah. For the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Come and let us smite him with a dun, and let us not give heed to any of his words. So obedience is more than listening. Obedience means to hearken. So he's given a choice. He agrees to listen, but he is given a choice. Look at verse 17. Then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, Thus saith, what's those next two words? The Lord. God says this, the God of hosts, the God of Israel. If thou wilt assuredly go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live in thine house. Now, it's not the optimal situation. He's no longer king and in command, but his life will be spared, and his city will be spared, and his people will be spared. His soul shall live, more than just life. So all of these things are put. He shall live, and thine house. That's important. We'll look at that. If he does not, there will be horrible consequences. Verse 18, but if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylonians' princes, then this city shall be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. Now, as a human being, a lot of times we don't like choices that are beyond our control, do we? Here's his choice. You're either going to go surrender, be taken by the Babylonians, and they're going to take you, but you will live, and this city will not be burned. Or, on the other hand, the city's going to be burned, and things are going to be real bad for you and for your family. He was kind of put to the point. His options had been exhausted. God had not delivered the city like he did in the days of Hezekiah because it had rebelled against him. The Egyptians had came, but they'd been defeated and they depart. His options are being slowly taken away, and as human beings, we like to have options. He hoped for a way of escape and some way out of this, but the city's surrounded. His options are being taken away. But God presents him with a way for him to survive, for the city to survive. But unfortunately, he reasons this situation out because he's afraid of the wrong things. What causes it? What causes people's reasoning to be off? Well, first of all, it's sin. And that's Zedekiah's whole problem. He doesn't want to recognize what God has to say. But he's afraid of the wrong things. Proverbs chapter 28 says, the wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as a lion. He's trying to reason out what he can do and what can happen rather than trusting the one that knows what will happen. Does God know what's going to happen tomorrow? Does God know what's going to happen 10 years from now should he carry his coming? Yeah, he knows exactly what's going to happen. How much better to trust the one that knows the future rather than us try and reason it out and come up with something with it. But he is afraid. What's he afraid of? Zedekiah the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand and they mock me. Well, isn't that nice? He is afraid. There was a group that had went out to the Chaldeans, that had surrendered the Chaldeans. And he's afraid that they're going to give him over into their hand and they're going to mock him. Now, they deserted. They're probably numerous. There's a good possibility some of those are actually heeding the warnings. Others might have been mad at Zedekiah for refusing to submit. And his thought is that they would mock him. Now, that could mean anything from verbally mocking to abuse. He's afraid of that. What's the greater fear here? Now, a lot of times we get afraid of things that don't and won't happen when we fail to be afraid of the things that we shouldn't. These fears were not founded. Verse 20, Jeremiah said, they shall not deliver thee, obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord, which I spake unto thee, so it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. He's afraid of the wrong things. He's afraid of these people that had done that. And he's in fear when he shouldn't be in fear. Psalm 53, verse 5, they were in great fear where no fear was, for God had scattered the bones of him that encamped against thee. Thou hast put them to shame, because God hath despised thee. He's in fear when he shouldn't have been feared. Now, what are we fearful of? I hate this time of year. I honestly do, and I didn't really touch on it this morning, but I'll tell you, you look at today and you look at tomorrow being Halloween, and everything is fear, and a lot of that fear is a cult. Matter of fact, the whole idea of Halloween comes from a pagan festival called Samhain. and without going into all that, but people live in fear. And everything on TV and everything like that is fear and ghost stories and all of this stuff. And they're going the wrong direction with this. They're not fearing God, but they're fearing the devil. He's afraid of something he shouldn't be afraid of, rather than fearing God. Psalm 56 verse 3 says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." What are you afraid of? Everyone here is afraid of different things. We can worry about things, and we can stew about things. And I don't know what your fears are. You don't know what my fears are. Although I don't know if it was monkeys stealing our bulletin boards in that dream or not. But, you know, we can laugh at things like that. But there are things sometimes we get afraid of that are, you know, don't make any sense. And just like that dream didn't make any sense. There are things that we get afraid of that don't make any sense. And, you know, we can laugh at that, but sometimes people get so afraid of things that they shouldn't be afraid of, rather than fearing the right things. Our reason and our fear do not know the future. It speculates. We assume much and guess more. But had he truly feared God, he would have obeyed. Verse 20, "But Jeremiah said, They shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord, which I speak unto thee, so it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live." You know, the nice thing about fearing God is, once you fear him, you don't need to fear. Now, I know that doesn't quite make sense there. But if you have a fear of God, you know he takes care of you.
Amen.
So that fear that he has is unfounded when he should have feared what God had to say. Because God knew what was going to happen. All he needed was to go forth, and he does that, but he does it in the wrong way and for the wrong purpose later on. All it did was it required faith in what God had said, and he had none of that. He was presented a clear choice for what God had said, and do what God had said and live, or face judgment, and it's going to be bad. What he really needed to do was fear God. Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 12. "And now, O Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul." And if you look at the assessment of Zedekiah over in 2 Kings chapter 24, he didn't do that. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. You know, when we fear God, the fear of man eases. Psalm 118 verse 6, "The Lord is on my side, I will not fear what man can do unto me." Spoke of John Weatherford, while he's preaching out the windows, they slashed his hands. He's bleeding everywhere, and he kept on preaching. Wow. What a testimony. You know, man can only do so much to us, but God has control. When we fear God, we have that assurance that he is there. Proverbs 29 verse 25, "The fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe." Only what God only allows what he allows. And it's in his hands. Well, this is consequences. Does God know what he's going to do? Mm-hmm. So God repeats himself. Verse 21, "But if thou refuse to go forth, this is the word which the Lord has showed me, and behold, all the women that are left in the king of Judah's house shall be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes, and those women shall say, Thy friends have set on me, and have prevailed against me. Thy feet are sunk in the mire, and they are turned away back. So that shall they bring out all thy wives and thy children to the Chaldeans, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand." You're not going to get away. That is very clear, very uncertain terms. You're not going to get away. And thou shalt not escape out of their hand, but shall be taken by the hand of the king of Babylon, and thou shalt cause this city to be burned with fire. That's what's going to happen. These are the consequences. When God has to repeat himself, have you a parent go, don't make me repeat myself. Well, God has to repeat himself. I think that's getting kind of serious. You know, sometimes when reason takes over, we reason we've done enough. If we obey partially, that's enough to take care of us. And I'm afraid that's what happens here. Verse 24, then said Zedekiah and Jeremiah, let no man know of these words, and thou shalt not die. But if the princes hear that I have talked with thee, and they come unto thee, and say unto thee, declare unto us now what thou hast said unto the king, hide it not from us, and we will not put thee to death. Also what the king has said unto thee. And then thou say unto them, I presented my supplication before the king, that he would not cause me to return to Jonathan's house to die there. And in a way he did that, because will you not put me to death? And he concentrates on that first part, not putting him to death, but he misses the whole second part. He reasons that he's done enough there. Then came all the princes unto Jeremiah and asked him. He told them according to all these words which the king commanded. So they left off speaking with him, so the matter was not proceeded. So Jeremiah abode in the court of the prison until Jerusalem was taken, and he was there when Jerusalem was taken. I'd say he had fair warning, wouldn't you? God repeated himself twice here, even though he had heard this times before. God was fair. He warned him. But despite all God's warnings, the people still insist on making bad decisions. They reason it out, they figure it out, and they just make bad decisions. Sometimes they put it off. Now, I don't know exactly how many days was this before the city fell, but it's sometime before that. I don't know if it was a month. I don't know if it's a week. The Bible doesn't lay it out exactly how much time transpired. What if he went right then? I think things might have turned out a little bit different. But he didn't. He put off the decision. So the city is besieged. Now, keep in mind, this happens in the middle of the siege. This is kind of a summary here. Verse 39, in the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, his army against Jerusalem, and they besieged it. And in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the city was broken up. So we're looking at a year and a half, roughly. For a year and a half, they are surrounded. Now, there's a brief reprieve when Egypt comes, but they are surrounded for a year and a half. Now, we don't know when this conversation goes on, but you think if that had been prophesied years before in Isaiah, that somebody would have came and went, maybe we ought to listen. A year and a half. Now, we don't understand what that would be like. They would surround a city and they would starve it out. Now, you'd have foodstuff stashed and you'd have water brought in there. And Hezekiah had built a tunnel that brought in water. I think history says they kind of stopped that. I can't remember if that was Babylonians or Titus. But they run out of food, they run out of water. That's bad. Had he surrendered, that wouldn't happen. But the city is besieged and it's taken. And they breach the wall. In the 11th month, Zedekiah, in the 4th month, and the 9th day of the month, the city was broken up. There'd be 2 walls in there, especially around the gate. There'd be an outer or inner wall. They're inside the inner wall. Once they get inside to that inner wall, they're in trouble. It's over with. Their defenses are breached. Matter of fact, they feel so secure. Look at verse 3. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate. Even Nergal. I'm not even going to try to pronounce these guys. I think I'd wrap my tongue around my head. With all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon. They're inside the has been said was going to happen happened. But you know what? He still doesn't get it. When Zedekiah sees this, instead of going, maybe God knew what he was talking about. Guys, can we talk? Through one gate. That's all it would take. Guys, can we talk? We surrender. You have us. Please have mercy upon my people. I'm the one you want. A man with character would have done that. And I think they would have seen that. Because what God laid out in His law, what God laid out in His Word, they would have seen that. But Zedekiah is more concerned about himself than his family, and his city, and his nation. Ooh, does that sound familiar? So what does he do? Verse 4. And it came to pass the seventh day, I got the wrong side there. I love trifocals. And it came to pass that when Zedekiah the king of Judah saw them, and all the men of war, that they fled. What did God say? You're not going to escape. They panicked and they flee. They went forth out of the city by night, by the way of the king's garden, by the gate betwixt the two walls, and went out the way of the plain. But the Chaldeans' army pursued after them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho when they had taken him. We'll pause there for just a second. That's about 15 miles. Now, that doesn't sound too far to us, does it? Quick little drive. That's about an 8-hour walk. Now, I imagine the army was going faster than that. That would be my guess. I don't know if there's any horses left. I don't know if there's any camels left inside the city. There may not have been. But, I mean, at a walk, it's 8 hours. But they get out of there. They only get that far. And exactly what God has warned that would come to pass will come to pass. And there are some awful results. When they had taken, they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the land of Hamath, where he gave judgment upon them. That's the same place that Jehoahaz was deposed by Pharaoh Necho. It's right on the border there. And the results are instant. Now, who is the one that persecuted Jeremiah even worse than the king? The nobles, right? The princes. Go to the end of verse 6. We'll come back to that. Also, the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. For the nobles, the results are instantaneous. They apparently flee with him, and those that didn't, they're in the city they capture. They were the ones that refused to listen. And I think it's likely from what we see in Ezekiel, they are the ones also that's actively involved in the idolatry. Because when you look and see in the chamber there, it's all the ancients of the nation. I think a lot of those nobles were the same ones that were involved in the idolatry that was going on in the temple. It's very likely that's the case. For them, the result is instantaneous. They are dead. They are dead. Does God see everything? Yeah. I don't know. I almost think the results for Zedekiah are worse than that for the nobles. Because when we look and see what happens here, it's sad. understand, God did not. God warned, don't do this. There's consequences if you don't listen. I'm going to remove my protection from you. And the man that was outside those doors didn't have mercy. He was a pagan. Eventually, God would get a hold of his heart, though. Look at verse 6. The reason why I say this may have been worse for Zedekiah than anything else. Then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes. What did God say? It would be well with his house if he surrendered. Now he sees the very thing that God had said was going to happen. Now, folks, God's not the author of evil. Understand that. But God removed his protection because he did not listen to him. He sees his sons, one by one, killed before his eyes. The Bible doesn't spell out how that happened. Now, the Assyrians were very brutal in how they did it. We don't know how the Babylonians did this. They may have cut their heads off. They may have tortured them before they killed them. Zedekiah is sitting there watching this whole thing where his sons are killed one by one right in front of him. And that's not all. That is the last thing he ever sees. Verse 7, moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains and carried him to Babylon. The last thing that he sees is his sons being killed one by one by one by one. And then they put out his eyes. I've heard people that have went blind, and they remember the last things they saw. Could you imagine that being the last thing you ever saw? How horrible. That was stuck in his head for the rest of his days, and we don't know how many days he lived after this. When Jehoiachin is eventually raised up to sit among the kings in Babylon. But he lives with this as the last thing he saw for the rest of his life. Man. Not only that, does sin always just affect the person that sins? There's always collateral damage. Don't blame God for that, by the way. Blame man's sin. But there's collateral damage. And by the way, the nation of Israel had followed in the same footsteps that he had. But there were consequences of others on others. Matter of fact, Zedekiah's sin had consequences on others going back. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 18. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judea until he had cast them from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. His actions and what he did as king had a far-reaching effect because he led them into the same paganism. If you look over in Ezekiel, when God removes his presence from the temple, the temple is no longer a holy place dedicated to God. It's dedicated to every false god that was around. How awful. And for 2 years, as we saw there, this city has been besieged. People starved to death. We see in an earlier siege, there's actually cannibalism that goes on. I don't know that any of that went on. But people become desperate. And people have already died because he wouldn't do what God had told him to do. And then things get worse from there. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 25, and we'll wind it up with 2 Kings chapter 25. Things just go downhill from there. Everything just gets worse and worse and worse. And what happens is exactly what God had warned him about. Look at verse 8. And in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, and servant of the king of Babylon in Jerusalem. And he burnt the house of the Lord. How awful. Now, it had become pagan. I mean, that is awful to see what's happened. This is exactly what was said back when Solomon built the temple. What would happen if they forsook the Lord? He burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house. And what's that next word? All the houses of Jerusalem. And every great man's house burnt he with fire. The consequences of what Zedekiah did just didn't last as Zedekiah went to everybody that was in Jerusalem. Everybody's house was burned. Those that didn't starve and those that didn't die were led away in fetters to be prisoners. Had he surrendered, things would have turned out different. Look at verse 11. Now the rest of the people that were left in the city and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon with the remnant of the multitude did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away. Only a few left. They're carried away. The house of the Lord is destroyed. Look at verse 13. The pillars of brass that were in the house of the Lord, and the bases and the brazen sea that was in the house of the Lord, did the Chaldees break in pieces and carry the brass of them to Babylon. And the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the spoons and all the vessels of brass whereof they ministered took they away. By the way, he'd already taken away the gold. They were left with a cheap substitute. And the fire pans and the bowls and such things were of gold and the silver, and the captain of the guard took away the 2 pillars, 1 sea, and the basins which Solomon had built for the house of the Lord. The brass of all these vessels was without weight. All this is gone. The house of the Lord is wiped out. All the stones are knocked over. It's destroyed. The walls are destroyed. All of this thing comes down. Sin never has consequences for only one person. It goes beyond that. There are spiritual consequences because the house of the Lord is destroyed. There are physical consequences for people because people are killed. People starve. People are killed during the siege. People are killed during the invasion. Their houses are burned. There's consequences to all that. Now we look at all that, and I think that just comes back to we need to make decisions that God has said. We need to always go by what God has said. Because to not do that is a very dangerous thing. All our decisions, everything we do in life, ought to be tempered by what the Bible has to say. We ought to obey God in how we live, in what we do, in how we go about our lives, in who we vote for, in all of these things. We ought to take into account what the Bible has to say. Sometimes we're the people on the other end of that. There were those that God spared out of all this. There were those that didn't bow the knee. There were others that, we looked at Ebed-Melech last week, and God spared his life. I'll tell you what, I fear for us as a nation. We're kind of almost to that point. Now, there's a lot of people that love the Lord and believe in the Lord, but we're becoming fewer and fewer. And we got to wake up. We got to do what's right. We got to reach others. We We have to do and be what the Lord has commanded. I don't want to see this happen in America. I fear that day's coming.
Amen.
But I tell you, it doesn't mean it's going to happen like this, by the way. But I tell you what, we always ought to make every decision we make in life according to what this book says. Rather than our own reasoning, like what Zedekiah did, rather than our own thoughts, because this is the only right way to do it. And that's by the book. Let's do it by the book. Let's go.